I'm going to talk about sow housing. I'm going to give you a little history and some of my personal perspectives or philosophies, and I want to get us to some tools that are available as we consider sow housing. And so one of the things to start is the first big move was moving from outside to inside. So I've been at the university for 21 years. When I started, most of the sows were inside, but not all of them. Today, I'm not going to say all of them are, because somebody will say mine aren't, but 99% are inside. And that was a big change. And so some of the reasons, it was better use of the land, more efficient use, because we could fit more sows per unit of land. It was a lot less labor. One person could take care of a lot more sows if they were taking care of pigs and not filling in mud holes and fixing broken water lines that were frozen and patching barbed wire, and allowed us to capture manure nutrients and utilize them. As chemical fertilizer went up, manure became more valuable. Incredible feed efficiency differences inside versus outside, especially in the wintertime. We can heat with propane or use the body heat better inside. And then health was a reason, and we can go back and forth of whether they're healthier inside or outside, but it was one of the main reasons. So if we decide to move inside, which most people have at this point, we have to think about a couple of other things. So are we going to house animals in groups or individually? And so when we think about having them in groups, we have other decisions to make. Are they going to be small groups? And we think of 5 or 8 or 10. Maybe we think of 20 or 25. Or are we going to go to large groups? And we used to think of kind of 25 to 50 was large, and now we think maybe 80 or 200 or whatever those numbers are. And so those are ambiguous terms, but that's things kind of break out that way. And which decision we make has a big impact on how we manage them. And it ties in with some of the other things. So are those groups static or dynamic? And as we talk about sow housing, we hear that a lot as well. And so a static group is we put a pen of sows together, and they stay together until they move to farrowing. A dynamic group is we put a group of sows together, and later we put some more in, and we take some out. And it might be when they go to farrowing, or they're preg checked open, or they're weaned. And that's a very different scenario from a welfare and a production and a management perspective. Some systems will have stall access in addition to group housing, and we'll talk a little bit about a couple of those. And that's, again, a different paradigm. And once they're grouped, we have a decision of space per female. If we decide to put them in stalls, that space is set. So if it's 2 feet wide, 7 feet long, every sow has 14 square feet. If we have a 140 square foot pen, we can put 10 sows in there at 14 square feet. We could put 8 in there at more than 14, or we could put 12 in at less than. Right? We can't put 2 in a stall. So we know space per sow is set in a stall, but it's not in group housing. So besides group or individual, and then within the group, these options, we have competitive feeding or non-competitive feeding. And when we think of competitive feeding, it means we're going to feed sows, and some of them are going to probably get more than others. Okay? And so floor feeding is what we think of and what we did when a lot of sows were outside with a concrete pad, and they dump it on the floor and they come and eat. Skip-a-day feeding nobody likes to talk about. But it was done, probably is still somewhere, and we would feed every other day or every third day. And the idea was that the big bully sows ate their fill, and then the more timid sows got to come and eat their fill too. And they got 2 days worth of feed in a day, or 3 days worth of feed in a day. And it doesn't sound good from a welfare perspective. The research suggested that it was pretty good, except for maybe parity 1 females, and probably not the first 30 days of gestation. But we worry a lot about what things look like or sound like today, so we're probably not going back to that. The partial stalls, those end up being competitive, okay? And so we'll talk about a couple of those. Free access stalls are the system where they can go into a stall or come out of a stall at their will. They tend to be fed in the stalls. They are competitive because sows can choose any of the stalls. And so they aren't where we can really give them individual feed intake. Non-competitive, of course, gestation stalls where everyone is housed there and she has access to whatever we put in front of her. The ESF is what I'll use for electronic sow feeders. So there's a feeding station. Every sow has an electronic tag. When she walks through, the reader tells the feeding station who she is, and the manager has programmed in the computer how much she eats. And while she's in there, nobody else can get at her. Okay? I put tethers on my list of non-competitive. I don't know a farm in the U.S. with tethers anymore, but if we chose to use them, it's still a non-competitive system. Okay? This trickle feeding or biofixation, I'll show you a couple slides on that, but that's in between. So it's designed to be non-competitive, but they're not confined. And so if everything works right, maybe it's maybe it is. Now, when I took this figure from this website, you'll see these sorts of layouts a lot. Pens with partial stalls, full stalls, kind of the mix. There's lots of options. Okay, so within the big change, a lot of the early ones, these are all pictures I took, so I know there's no copyright on them. A lot of the early ones were putting them in old finishing floors just because, they had solid floors and they were inside. Then we did some penning with more. That's actually not a gestation barn, but could be. Today, last time a survey was done, almost all of our sows are in gestation stalls. Okay, and we can talk about why that was. I will talk a little bit about that. Okay, and so most of our sows moved into stalls, and I think 87% of sows were in stalls during gestation was the last official survey work that was done. This figure you've probably seen before. This is a USDA pig statistics figure on where pigs are. Each blue dot is 20,000 pigs. Okay, and they're centered around the Midwest, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Texas Panhandle. If you're from Utah, you know where Circle 4 is. If you're not, that's where Circle 4 is. But this figure is not. This is the 2007. If you look at the one before, I don't have the most recent one is being done right now, right? But I thought it was interesting to go back and look at a couple of these that are older. So there's 1920. Now each dot is 5,000 pigs, not 20. So you'd have a fourth as many. But if you get close, you can see there's a lot of 5,000 dots here. There'd be enough that there should be some 20,000 dots if we had the same number of pigs. Out in the valley there, Upper Plains, across East Texas, the whole southeastern region. There's 1880. Each dot is 5,000 pigs. Okay, now in all of them, pig production is centered in the middle of the country, right here. There's a lot of corn, there's a lot of ground for spreading manure. There's a lot of reasons for that. This is a figure that shows population. So if you pick your favorite city, you can see where it is. And if it's a big city, it's a higher peak. So for the most part, the pigs are where the people aren't. And that's not necessarily not by design, right? So we moved sows inside. Most of us ended up putting sows in stalls. And I'll show you a figure of why we originally did that. The justification back in the 60s. But as most of the stalls were going in, those reasons still existed, but also it was easier to do artificial insemination. It was also easier to give vaccinations. It was easier to manage more pigs per person, right? And we believe that sows have better welfare. Most of the people who put sows in stalls did it because they thought it was better for the pigs. Okay? So we could feed skinny pigs more, we could feed fat pigs less, and none of them fought. Okay? So today, because of those population dynamics, we're considering getting rid of stalls, because some people think it's better for welfare. I'm not going to argue one way or another. I'll show you other people who have argued. So the AVMA, it's not the AASV, not the swine veterinarians. This is all the veterinarians. And there's as many people in here that are vegetarians there's far more in here that are vegetarians than are pig vets. Okay? They commissioned a study of the scientific literature on sow housing. And this is 10 years old now. And they had a panel. They had 3 people from the AVMA. They had a behaviorist who was an academic behaviorist. They had an epidemiologist who was an academic. They had the humane organizations were represented by somebody from HSUS who are vegan. They had a producer, an independent producer from Missouri. They had a couple of research scientists, a veterinarian with an MBA from Illinois, and an animal scientist who did a lot of sow housing research from Texas Tech. They had a statistician who was an academic, and then they had a practicing veterinarian. So a pretty diverse group. And I'll show you some of their stuff, but the other report that is referred to a lot because it's in the scientific literature, it's a review paper, is the CAST paper. I'm also looking at welfare in housing, and they kind of use the same sort of principles. Here's AVMA. And they said, we're looking at housing. We're deciding, within literature, what does the data say about minimizing aggression, protecting them from extremes of weather, reducing exposure to hazards that cause pain or disease, providing every animal with appropriate amounts of feed and water every day, facilitating observation of respiratory rate, of appetite, etc., and allowing animals to express their normal behaviors. Okay? So they looked at all the scientific literature, and what they found is that nothing that we do for sow housing satisfies all these. But that all of them are acceptable until we come up with something better, as long as they're managed right. Okay? And that included the author of the paper. It was everybody on that list, including HSUS, who still doesn't like stalls. Okay? So it changes our conversation, and I thought I really ought to include a behaviorist in some way, shape, or form if I'm talking about sow housing. So Ed Pager is the one I chose because he presented this once and I loved it. I'm going to read this to you. 2 dog owners met one day to walk their dogs together. One owner had grown up in a small family that valued health, safety, and orderly, disciplined behavior. The dog of this owner received regular veterinary care, 2 meals a day of low-fat dog food, and was walked on a leash. The other owner had grown up in a large community that valued feasting, communal living, sharing of resources, and close contact with the natural world. The dog, the third of the owners, the first 2 had been killed by cars, had burrs in its coat, was fed generously but sporadically, and had never worn a collar in its life. Each owner, judging quality of life from very different viewpoints, felt sorry for the other's dog. Okay, so pig farmers like stalls. There's not enough pig farmers in the country for stalls to be something that everybody's going to like. Okay, this helped me really appreciate that. So I did want to show you some slides, and this is from a talk that I did 10 years ago on sow housing. And I couldn't find this figure again, but I had done a screenshot. This was on John McGlone's at Texas Tech's, his sow housing website. And he had found this from an 1807 publication that was in Emma Baxter's book in 1984. You can see the picture. They called them, I forgot what they called them. But each pig had a little area that it was confined to, and the quote was that each to contain a pig and to fit him as near as may be when he is in, he cannot attempt to turn himself around. Okay, so this is going back to the early 1800s. Okay, it didn't become popular for a long time, but this one I really liked. This was also on John's site, but I couldn't find it again. But he said this was from the Hog Farm Management magazine in 1969. It was on a farm in Indiana. This is 2 tethered sows. And the caption of the picture is, "Sows usually become used to the tie stall quite quickly. As sows are always isolated, social problems are eliminated, and complete control of feed intake is possible." So in the 60s, we were talking about improving welfare of sows by individual housing. Okay? So this is, again, thinking about kind of some perspectives. Why did we do what we did? How did we get to where we were? Does it make sense to walk away from it? Okay? Can we do better today than we did when we thought we needed to do that? So a few other slides in here from my older stuff that kind of set a little bit of my mindset, my perspective, and I should probably tell you a little story. I interviewed for a job when I was finishing my PhD. It was November of 1993. And at the research center where I was interviewing, they were building a new sow facility, and they showed me the blueprints, and they said, "What would you change?" I said, "Well, I think you need to put in a fully slatted floor." And they had what you would expect for a stalled floor, solid in the front third and slats in the back. And they said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I think in 10 years, we're not going to have gestation stalls." That was 1993. Okay? It's a long time ago, if you want to do the math. I was wrong. We still haven't. Okay? So 5 years ago, I gave a talk in Missouri, and I said, everybody's committing to getting rid of stalls by meat from pigs in stalls by 2017 or 2022. So I think we're going to lose stalls. We haven't. Okay, a few states have. My home state, I grew up in Oregon, gave up stalls. I work with Oregon pork producers. At least every other year I'm out there. And I polled them, and they said, "We can't find a gestation stall in Oregon." But they passed a law to get rid of them. Okay, so that comes back to those population centers, and does it really matter? And we're fighting people that it's a whole different conversation, right? And they fought to protect them, even though none of them had them, because it's something that they wanted to be able to do, because it should be a science-based and a farmer-based decision. Okay. Anyway, So this was something I put together for that talk a few years ago in Missouri, talking about what do we do with small group housing. So I'm thinking again back to those 510. So we got to sort them properly. So we talk a lot about sorting on size. So most people will say we want sows that are small together and sows that are big together with other big sows, because otherwise there's a lot more, getting beat up because the big sow beats up the little sow. Okay, there's also some research that says actually what we want is one big sow to be able to show who's boss, and then there's less fighting. Okay, and there's people that do that with a boar. Put a boar in with them, and then we know who's in charge, and the sows don't fight as much. Okay, and you can find research about either, and others in this room might be, certainly are, more familiar with that part of the literature if we want to say there's consensus. But sorting by condition and aggressiveness, I think, makes a lot of sense. Okay, if we're going to limit feed an animal at the same time, unless we have individual feed access somehow. And then there's differences in eating speed. And so I got 4 kids. They're 6, 8, 10, and 12 years old. And I can tell you, the 10-year-old is done first every time at any meal and eats twice as much as the others. The 12-year-old will always be last. Okay, just who they are. And if I was going to feed them a limited amount on a table, I couldn't put them at the same table together. The 12-year-old would starve to death. If we've got static groups, if we've got small groups, we probably need to have static groups. Okay? And so what we think about here is they're going to fight for 2 or 3 days, and then they're going to figure out who's tougher than the other, and they're going to say, you're boss. Okay? If we have dynamic groups in a small pen, it doesn't matter if we take the submissive pig or the dominant pig. They have to reestablish it every time we mix. So if we're going to go with small groups, we really want to think about stable pens. And then I'll show you, I talked about mixing a new pen, but we'll talk about that later. We need to have adequate space. Kind of goes without saying. So I mentioned trickle feeding or biofixation. This was a slide that Don Levis had prepared for the Sow Housing Forum that was also in Des Moines. And June 6, 2007. Okay? And I just stole some slides from Don when I put this talk together. So you can see they got a little bit of shoulder stall. That feed trickles in there 0.2 to 0.4 pounds per minute. So they call it trickle feeding because it's trickling, or biofixation because they're biologically fixed. And so the pig, the reason they fight is to get more feed, right? And they're stealing feed from somebody else. But they figure out that the best chance to get more feed is to wait right here. And a little more is going to trickle out. Okay? And that's the theory. And I've never worked with biofixation system before. I don't really know how well they work, but there aren't any that I'm aware of in Missouri. So you have to show me if we're going to put them in Missouri. Of course, you need adequate space, and it has to be a feeder space for each pig. Yep. So with biofixation, you have to have an eating space for each pig. Okay. Now you could, if they were really expensive, you could have one where a feeding station. So they fed in there, and then they moved, and another group came in and fed. But there has to be a space for every pig in that pen at feeding time. Yep.
You mentioned that with the smaller pens, that static works better. Do you have a definition of small in that regard?
So most people will tell you 80. Okay. And so I live in Missouri. And most of our kids that come from these small towns, and I say, who's the toughest kid in your town? Okay, you know who it is. You figure that out quickly, right? When they go down to see the Arch in St. Louis, they can't tell. So they don't fight, right? And that, for sows, it seems to be about 80. They can't keep track of who's tougher than them and who's not, so they don't fight. They just don't try to establish it. I'll show you a couple things that are in our tools here a little bit later. Okay? Yeah, we'll skip that. So large groups, what I was talking about that time, we're back sorting properly, and it doesn't matter what the group is, but size, condition, aggressiveness, eating speed. If they're large enough, and 80 is the magic number that the people always throw out that do this research, then we can talk about being dynamic. So if we put some pigs in, they don't necessarily recognize these as new pigs. And the new pigs have so many other new pigs that they don't necessarily have to prove that they're tougher than anybody. And so that's the number that people come to. Again, they need adequate space. We can talk about design, so give more wall space. They like to lay against walls, and so we put kind of random walls and pens and stuff like that. Here we come back to skip-a-day feeding as something that could be incorporated, but is not likely to if we're going to group housing for a welfare image. Going to skip a day feeding is not likely to make that look better. So electronic sow feeding I showed you is the single group housing system that allows individual feed intake. Here's just pictures with sows in pens, group housing, or sorry, the electronic sow feeder there or here. So again, each sow has an ID tag. She goes in, and what you'll see if you track that, you've got a computer, and somebody has to look at it every day, make sure every sow in there. If she is not recorded as having entered and eaten, she either is sick and not eating, she's dead and not eating, or her tag came out. All right? So we've got to look at that every day. But it's possible, and we can feed skinny ones more and fat ones less. We can talk about managing electronic sow feeding farms, but we'll go past that for now. So you've got to train them to do that. They don't just walk in and know there's feed in there, so there's an added step of getting them trained to know that they go in there to eat, and then there's some dominance, and the dominant pig eats usually first. So if feed drops at 2 a.m., she eats at 2:01 and on down until the last one eats. Most of the manufacturers suggest 20 to 50 pigs per feeding station, and there's some variations there, and I'd say you need to visit with your manufacturers. Having multiple feeders per pen helps reduce fighting, so now you need bigger pens, of course. Absolutely critical to have daily monitoring. And at the time when I put this together, I'd gone to Grandin.com and seen what Temple Grandin was saying, and Temple was saying we ought to turn off electronic sow feeders for part of the day so that they rest. And I left it on here, but the farms in Missouri with electronic sow feeders, they don't eat 24 hours. They actually eat and then they rest. So I don't think I could back that up. Caitlin? So I come back and say, how do we choose a sow housing system? And I think you're doing this as a business. If you're doing this for fun, great, then we'll have a different conversation. But most people raising pigs want to make some money at it. And so I think the first question is, can this housing system be economically sustainable? Okay. Now we're asking, is it socially acceptable? And we didn't used to ask that. Our social norms accepted that farmers made the best decisions, and today maybe that isn't accepted. Does it fit our existing physical resources? So if it's in the barn and we have to go from 14 square feet plus the aisles and we have to go to 18 square feet to use a system, now we have to reduce the number of sows, or we have to add some barn space, or how do we accommodate that? Or do we remodel it? Do we replace it? Okay. Does it fit our existing human resources? And I don't just mean numbers, because we can hire more people, but at my university farm, I had a manager who was an amazing pig guy. And if I'd have asked him to manage an electronic sow feeder, it wouldn't have happened. He retired. I hired his son as my manager. I could put anything I want in there, okay? So I can show you. That's my phone. It's a flip phone, okay? I'm not one of these guys who's enamored of technology. If it works, it works. But so we're going to use whatever we want, okay? And then does it fit the culture? And that's that sort of comment as well. Are we likely to make group housing work? It takes a different way of looking at things, a different way of looking at pigs, different husbandry skills, not necessarily better, but different. Okay? And if that's not who we are, then is that the system for us? Or should we change who we are? I just throw this space table out. The Midwest Plan Service is the one that most people refer to. And it comes back to if we're doing remodels and existing resources, do we have enough space to go to these various systems? And the data behind these numbers, I asked Don Levis, who was the one that provided them, and he said there's not a lot of good hard data. So that question has come up when I've presented this before, and there needs to be more there. But I don't want us to go to the next phase without mentioning that combination of systems is also possible. And usually when we talk about sow housing in a group like this, or even in our materials that I'm going to show you, we talk about one system. But in reality, a combination of systems often works, and is sometimes preferred. And so this is one of Levis's figures, and if you get into sow housing online, you'll see lots of repetition of some of these. But here's conventional gestation stalls. Here's converting that area to pens. And so we've got partial slats, partial solid, and how do you do that? And so in most of our times when we're combining them, we're going to have them in stalls for estrus detection and mating, okay? And then for the first 30 or 40 or maybe 45 days. So we confirm them pregnant. So we've got our housing so they didn't fight. We got skinny sows back to condition. We've got our ease of insemination, et cetera. And now going to group housing isn't near as hard on the pig. They're going to fight, but it's possible. Okay? And I bring this up as this combination because sometimes I think it's the best for the pig, and it is the European Union standard. And so if it's good enough for the European Union from a social perspective, it'll probably satisfy most of our people that are concerned about that. Okay? So if we say what are the existing resources, if you just Google sow housing and sow housing resources or something like that, you'll find, I would hope you would find John McGlone's site with the sow housing site. He's got a lot of information on there. Some of what's on here isn't live today. Some of what was on there before, but it's a site. There's good information. E-Extension has this, and there's other materials on here as well, but this one says 2015, but it also says that this is when Don Leibus was at Ohio State, and he wasn't there anymore in 15, so the original version of this was sometime before then. I don't remember when, but this goes through a lot. This is good reading, and you can look at building environment, manure systems, watering systems, feeding systems, and housing options. There's a lot of good reading in here, and there's some good images, good things to think about. I wanted to focus today a little bit more on some of the pork checkoff materials. And so if you go to sow housing site on the pork.org, there's your three things: the position statement, sow housing options, and sow housing management. There's the position statement, but it's too small for you to read, so if I blow it up, we're looking at sow housing advantages and disadvantages for well-being, so minimizing aggression, reduce competition, allow individual feeding, assist controlled body condition. What are the disadvantages of individual? They restrict movement and exercise, restricts ability to perform foraging behaviors, and sows have limited social interactions. So some of those normal behaviors are fighting. What about individual? They get freedom of movement and exercise, they get social interaction, but you also get aggression and injury, uneven body conditions, and inability to forage if no manipulable materials are present. An advantage that's not on there is that exercise. What is the advantage of that exercise? And is it just making us feel better? There's pretty good research that shows that exercise helps her, and it shortens duration of farrowing because she's in better physical condition, maybe lower stillborn rates, those sorts of things. And so that comes back to maybe that combination system is something that really could help us. Okay. So the National Pork Board, there's your statement, and basically I just want you to look at the one time. The foundation of the statement is what's best for the pig, and they all work depending on the individual care given to the pig. Okay. I'm not going to read the rest of that. You can go read it if you like. So again, back to the sow housing site. That second one is sow housing options, and if you click on that, it's smaller than I thought. But these are fact sheets that came out in 2 years ago, Sherry? So these are 2 years old. The target audience for these cards are kind of randomly put around in your seat. The target audience for this was the decision maker. So you're deciding, what am I going to do for sow housing? Okay, and so there's guide sheets on gestation stall, design and space, group housing system, choice of design, forming gilt and sow groups, floor space allocation, genetic considerations, identifying and treating and preventing lameness, nutritional considerations, production flow and management, new and conversion construction, and then a conversion financial model. And these are all available online. And there's a lot of good information in here. Okay, again, especially for the decision maker. So if you look at the gestation stall one, kind of their summary, they allow you to observe every sow every day, observe the water allowance, adjust feed allowance timely. You have to manage the thermal control system, match the sow size to the stall size, provide an exercise pen if needed. You have to allow the pig to see other pigs, and then they have a little discussion about turnaround crates. Okay, but it gives a lot of the background to kind of leading up to these things. And then the person, if they look at all these, they can decide, it helps to inform that decision. For me, this makes the most sense. Okay. Now I have just a little time to walk you through that last one, which is sow housing management. Okay, so this is a different target audience. So the target audience for this series is operating on the assumption that we already have our sow housing, and we have people that are going to manage sows in that. And so how do we help them to do that? And so what we did in developing those is said, what are the most common sow housing? So electronic sow feeding, free access stalls, feeding stalls, floor feeding, trickle feeding, and gestation stalls. Okay? Gestation stalls are still popular. They're still out there. They're still a good option. So we want to talk about how do we work those. These are on the back side of your sheet, kind of the front cover. There's three copies of each of these on the table outside. Oh, on this table. So, if you're interested and you're quick, you can get one on the way out if they match your thing. If not, you can order them on the pork store or you can download them. Each of them are set up following a similar format. Okay, so you can think of it like the written SOPs, kind of bullet points, try to be straightforward, to the point, help people in the barn do what they do in the barn well. Okay, and so we talk about the management and husbandry skills needed for success. We've tried to base that on research where it existed, and where we lacked research, we used personal experience. And then at the end of each one, we have a daily checklist that you would do if you have this type of feeding system. These are the things you need to do every day as you walk through. And then at the end of each one, we also develop some scenarios. So these are things that might go wrong. And so here's a scenario, here's the question that you would ask. And we didn't give the answers, okay, because it's not to give the answers to each question. We didn't come up with everything that could go wrong, but it's to facilitate that conversation among the caretakers, make them engage their brains about what they're doing, and engage with that decision maker as well of how to make it work. Okay, so within the husbandry skills for success within each system, so this is, again, that kind of the SOP sort of model. Maintenance of equipment, behavior at mixing, except that's not there for the gestation stall one because they never get mixed. Caretaker safety concerns, that's in all of them. In gestation stalls you have concerns because you can get your leg pinched in there, your hand, or you're going to move pigs, some of that. Training gilts and sows, especially for the electronic sow feeding and the free access stalls. They have to be trained how to go in to eat and how to open it to get back out. Considerations on individual sow observation, body condition scoring, and that's pretty similar for all of them. Identifying lameness, monitoring health, heat detection and artificial insemination. Somewhat different, of course, in a stall, but most of the rest of them are pretty similar. Then pregnancy detection, how do you handle fallout sows, and managing ventilation. Okay, and those exist again in all of them. And then again at the end, there's a daily checklist and the troubleshooting scenarios. The team was academic folks from Canada and the U.S., and we worked together. Each person kind of took lead on one, and then we worked together, and Sherry kept us on schedule so that so we got done. So here's table contents for the electronic sow feeders. Okay? And basically it's that list of management things that I showed you, broken out. So there's the equipment maintenance, the behavior at mixing, etc. Okay? And so now people can go, I need to refresh myself on that, what I do. And that's most of these have a mix. Again, this targeted to people in the barns, and they may not have the time or the inclination to sit and read a book, and so they may be too thick, but they can break it into sections. But there's bullet points, pretty simple text, and then we try to have some images. So this text goes with that image at the bottom, which I just blow up, and it talks about if you have static groups. The light circles are gilts in first parity, the dark yellow are sows. So you can have a static all gilt pen or a static all sow pen. If you have a static mix pen, you have to have less than 90% sows. Okay? And so that's all up there in the bullet points. And the idea is that if there's not at least 10% gilts, they're going to get beat up. Okay? Because they're just too small relative to the rest of the pigs in the pen. And then the bottom one with the circle shows the dynamic. If you have a dynamic pen, you're going to introduce them. You want the new pigs to represent 10 to 30% of the pen, so that you don't put one new pig in there who gets the crap beat out of them. You put 10 or 30, and then the pigs that want to beat up the other pigs don't kill them, right? Because they spread around their bullying. And there's pictures because they will fight and they will get scratched. Okay? So again, this one is from the free access stalls, but it's almost the same, okay, among all of them. Okay, the ventilation is really similar regardless of the housing, other than if we're in gestation stalls, they have a 2 by 7 foot spot that they are. So they can do nothing to select a better thermal environment, right? They can only live in where we have big pens. They can choose thermal environments within there when possible. Used figures that some of these folks are already familiar with. Okay, and so if all of you are PQA Plus certified, you should be familiar with this behavior of pigs as a measure of thermal comfort. Pregnancy detection. So this is talking about ultrasound pregnancy detection. The picture in this case is in stalls, and I think it might be in all of them, but you do this a little differently when they're in pens. You're walking around with sows that are loose, and you've got other sows behind you. And so, for example, in some of our worker safety, in a stall, one person can go preg check everything. If we're in loose housing with large pens, we probably want 2 people in that barn so that somebody doesn't get upended by a sow when they're bending over preg checking a different sow, right? Body condition scoring, again, the condition scoring is about the same, but it ties in within this. It'll refer back to the different sections of the guide as well. And again, these are all available at Pork Store or online. I want to show you an example of the troubleshooting scenarios. These, again, not intended to be everything. This is the one for trickle feeding. It's the first 3. We actually had 5 or 6 on trickle feeding. And so the idea is that you sit folks down, and maybe new employees sitting down with other folks who've been there, and that's part of their orientation. And you say, scenario 1, you come in at feeding time, you observe that some sows are constantly moving from one feeding location to another, and some sows are gaining too much weight. So what are the questions on the right? Why do you think it's happening? What do you do to correct it? Okay. And we don't give the answers, but if you think through the bullet points and the pictures and the figures, you should be able to lead yourself to the answer. Okay. If you look at the third scenario, you got a new group of sows that moved into a pen 2 weeks ago. The group had 5 gilts and 23rd and 4th parity sows. During your daily walk through the barn, you notice that many sows continue to have fresh scratches on their necks and shoulders. So why is it occurring? How do you correct it? How do you prevent it from reoccurring? Okay? And so they should think back and say, well, it had to be at least 10 to 30% of the herd or of the pen, and is that right? And kind of think through what did they learn and help them apply that and think about that. So I'm afraid I don't have my checklist on there, but we have the daily checklist. And you can think of the daily checklist as the sorts of things you're trying to encourage people to have husbandry skills, and it should just become second nature. So if you take care of animals, when you leave, you should always be able, you walk out, you should be able to say, was there anything in there that didn't have feed, didn't have water, was sick, lame, dead? You should just notice those things. Are there waters dripping? Is there a fan belt squeaking? That's the sort of stuff that's in that checklist, and that's just to help encourage kind of good husbandry. A lot of folks being hired to work on farms don't have animal experience, and so we're trying to teach them a lot in some cases when they start. Okay? So this is the Jualas de Gestación, una guía para el manejo de cerdos. To remind me to tell you that these are also available in Spanish. This is the Gestation Stall Guide in Spanish. They're not printed, but they're all downloadable. Okay? And my Spanish is not good enough for me to tell you how good the translation is, but everything else that's been translated out of Chekhov has been good enough, certainly, to be usable. Okay? And again, we're targeting the folks doing the work. And on a lot of farms in some states more than others, their English skills are not such that giving them this is going to help them. Okay? So these are available, and if your Spanish skills are good and you lay them side by side, if you print them all, it's the same pictures, the same figures, it's the same guide. And we don't have it in other languages yet, but if people need it, maybe we could come up with that. Okay? So when I think about sow housing, I consider it to be a very dynamic topic. Okay? I think whether it's static or dynamic housing, it's something that changes all the time. And there's new literature, scientific literature that contributes to our knowledge. There's new experience, and there's new social norms. And so we have to adapt to all of those. Remember, back to how I think you choose sow housing, all of those things factor in there. The feeding and housing are inextricably linked. And so we can't think of one without the other. And so, again, back to tying into our resources, financial resources, physical, human, et cetera. And then these guides, these most recent ones that came out just last year, November, are really targeted at the folks who don't get to decide what sow housing we have, but they're hired and they're told this is what we have, and this is to help them make it work. Because, again, tie back to the summary of the AVMA review, and the scientific literature says any of these housing systems are fine as long as you manage them right. And so that's what these are really aimed at, is helping folks to manage them right. Okay? With that, I'd be happy to take any other questions.
One other comment, on one of those slides you showed where the mixing in a dynamic pen, that I think you said like 30% of the group is the minimum if you're adding new.
10 is the minimum.
10 is the minimum?
10 to 30.
10 to 30, okay. It may not always be possible, but I would also suggest that where it is possible, you mix the bigger group in with the smaller group rather than vice versa.
Yeah, so some of the other stuff that's in here, I had 45 minutes, in that says if you're going to put small pigs in with big pigs, put the small pigs in, let them get used to it, move the big pigs in. So they're the invaders. And there's a lot of good comments. This was all reviewed by producers after we prepared it, who had those systems, to try to make sure that we didn't say anything's too stupid, and that our review of the science and our personal experience was consistent with people who are in it every day. Because, for example, in Missouri, until 2 years ago, I think we had one farm with electronic sow feeders, and now I've got 7. And so I'll have a lot more personal experience with electronic sow feeders 2 years from now.
And that comment would apply to both pig size and group size.
Yep.
If you were writing the check, what would you build?
So, it really depends a lot on the social part. And so, I think the data, if you tried to balance everything, I think you would have gestation stalls for insemination and for 30 days to get them in condition. And then what you do after that, you can make arguments anything. We actually are about to write the check if we can't get our remodels afforded at the university, and we're talking a lot about that. And again, there's good data that says exercise for gestating sows actually has some value. Okay, is it enough to compensate for the injuries? Depends on our people. Okay, and so if we have, it takes a different skill set to achieve the same level of production with group house sows versus stalls. Okay, and so I'm not saying it, anything's possible. I mean, I know guys that never put a sow in a stall and have very admirable numbers. I know guys that could not achieve those same numbers with group housing. And so that's a personal choice. But I can make an argument. You tell me what you want, I'll argue for or against you, as you like.
I want you to keep using the word stall instead of crate.
I think I did.
Yes. But your written thing had crate. Not there, but there's an ordinance line.
Okay.
When they have the choice between, like, the free stall, has there been a wide difference in choice as far as maybe really prefer stalls or maybe really prefer?
So the free access stalls, where every sow has space in a stall and in the pen, 80 to 85% of the sows will be in a stall at any time that you look. And so you could argue so stalls are better. But if you say who's not in the stall, it's the dominant sow. So you could argue that the free space is better. And so, again, I'll argue whatever you want me to. Our goal was to give enough information that people could make intelligent, informed decisions.